Well, let me go ahead and begin our session. I'm Robin Hahnel, and I'm chairing the session. And we're talking about addressing the climate crisis, Green New Deals, what's going to work, what's not going to work. And we have three people who are presenting. I may do some commenting after the presentations, but we're hoping that people in the audience will be posting questions in chats and or be available to ask questions in person when we're done. We will leave time for plenty of audience participation and squabbling amongst ourselves, I might add. So the first person who's going to speak is Peter Dorman, who's a professor emeritus from Evergreen State University in Washington State. And he'll be followed, I lost my screen, okay. And then he'll be followed by Eric Tymoigne, who is a professor at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. And Thomas Stölner is going to be the third speaker. He is speaking from Germany, where I guess it's evening time by now. And he had the pleasure of managing a huge conference a few months back at Freiburg University that many of us participated in and appreciated very much. So with no further ado, Peter, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. So let me begin by saying that this talk will be roughly based on a book which I've written and will be coming out at some point in the first half of next year, called Alligators in the Arctic and How to Avoid Them. And it's a wide-ranging book on the science and economics and policy of dealing with climate change. It'll be published by Cambridge University Press. So I'm going to do a few things in this talk. I'm going to begin very briefly by explaining why the future livability of the planet, avoiding a true climate catastrophe and not just the ill effects that we're experiencing now, requires sticking to a carbon budget. I'll describe what that means and where it comes from. Perhaps the most important point, or one of the more important points of the talk, will be to specify what I think constitutes a minimum program, which would enable us to stay within that budget. Onto that, we would add the problem of maintaining living standards of the world's peoples as we go through the transitional period. That will require additional policies and actions that go beyond the minimum program. And finally, and very importantly, I'll survey the political economy problems associated with this and try to explain why it is that in the last 30 years, there's been no meaningful progress towards controlling carbon emissions anywhere, and what we need to accomplish in order to turn that around. So beginning with just the science on it, obviously this is quite complex, and I'm going to not give it the time it needs. We can get into details later if you want. But broadly speaking, the change in temperature worldwide, global warming, depends on the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. Currently, we're at over 400 parts per million, and if it's estimated that about 450 parts per million corresponds in the long run to a 2 degrees Celsius warming, which is the very upper limit that we should countenance. Now, it's important to recognize that this carbon concentration is a stock, not a flow. That is, it's cumulative in the way that a bank account is cumulative. You put money in your bank account and it increases, and it sums up all the flows that have gone into and out of it. And so the carbon concentration in the atmosphere is not based on flows over time periods. for instance, how much carbon we emit in a given year. Atmospheric carbon is a problem because of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels store the carbon that has been buried in the earth over geological time, and we are reversing hundreds of millions of years, in part, of Earth history by digging up this buried fossil energy, burning it, and sending the carbon back up into the atmosphere. The Earth used to be a lot hotter place once upon a time, and now we're making it hotter again. So if you establish a temperature limit that you want to adhere to, like, for instance, 2 degrees Celsius, that corresponds to a carbon budget. That is to say, an amount of carbon which you specify, which is the maximum that you allow yourself to emit over, let's say, the next 100 years or so. So it's how many chips you have left to play, so to speak. The current predilection for establishing target dates, like by 2050, we want to be at this level or that level, is virtually meaningless in that context, because every year's emissions draw down from that budget. The budget does not remain static over the next 30 years, and then suddenly you hit a target. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has enlisted quite a number of scientists, who, through a consensus process and also through different models, which they compare with each other, have considered the sensitivity of global climate to atmospheric carbon concentration. And they've concluded that if we wish to adhere to a 2 degree Celsius absolutely firm ceiling, then there's a corresponding carbon budget, which they have estimated with a margin of error. And I think it's prudent for us to take that carbon budget as a starting point for our own policy thinking. Now, the book that I wrote goes through the arithmetic here, and I'll just summarize the bottom line. Recognizing that poorer countries really have a strong need to increase their use of energy in order to meet a variety of needs of their people. And also the fact that wealthy countries became wealthier in large part because of their past burning of fossil fuels, which remain in the atmosphere, part of the problem. Even a minimal conception of social justice requires that carbon reductions in the wealthy countries be greater than the global average, so that the less wealthy countries can try to catch up in meeting needs. So what that roughly approximates to is about a 5% year after year annual reduction in carbon emissions in a country like the United States or in countries like those in the European Union, starting now and continuing for decades and decades to come, about 5% per year. On the one hand, it doesn't sound cataclysmic, but we have never achieved a 5% annual reduction. So this is already beyond our experience, and we would have to do it year after year after year. It is, in fact, an extraordinarily demanding benchmark. I'll just mention in passing, parentheses, that the models developed by the IPCC scientists usually don't follow a straight line equal annual emission reduction path, and they're probably right not to do so, but I'm just doing it now for benchmarking purposes. So on the basis of that, I would describe a minimum program as being that which forces economies, our economies, to achieve those reductions. And the simplest, most direct, and most practicable way to do that is to have a permit system where anybody who wishes to bring carbon into the economy by digging it up or having a pipeline or whatever and bringing carbon into the economy needs a permit. And the number of permits are limited. They go down by 5% every year. And And of course, by being limited, they're valuable. They're worth money. So we should auction them off. These are not handouts, or shouldn't be handouts. The revenue should be ours, all of ours, from auctioning off these permits. Now, no country has come close, even to a limited extent, in adopting such a program. And it's really important to understand why. But I'm going to put that off for now. But I just want to say that what I'm calling the minimum program is way, way, way beyond what any country on Earth has so far attempted. Now, I do want to say a bit about the issue of investment, green investment. That's the title of the panel. It's in the title, and it's also, of course, quite important politically right now. I'm certainly not opposed to green investment. I'll say a word more about why we need it shortly, but I want to make it clear that green investment is not a substitute for actually directly controlling carbon emissions through limiting them by law. One reason is that it is not possible for us to increase fossil fuels quickly enough to fully substitute for the fossil energy that we need to remove. The second, and this is really important to understand, is that on average every year the world as a whole uses about 3% more energy. Energy use is growing up. This is driven mainly by lower income countries that are electrifying and trying to acquire more energy. In that context, increasing renewables does not mean necessarily decreasing carbon fuels. On the contrary, it's quite likely that we'll see increases in both unless we directly restrict carbon fuels. An analogy, suppose that the objective were to stop all meat consumption in the world. That there was some problem with that. We had to stop it as soon as possible. Well, part of the solution would be growing more beans to provide protein for people. But if that were all you did, well, people would be eating meat and beans in their chili or in their feijoada or whatever they might be eating. So in addition to growing more beans, you would have to necessarily have measures that required the end or the limitation of slaughtering and eating animals. Now, the interesting thing about the minimum program in a technical sense is that we could begin doing it right now within the economic system we have. You could set up a permit system. We have hunting and fishing permits. We could have carbon permits. There's no technical reason why we couldn't do it. The problem, or one problem with it, is that it would result in a drastic and immediate drop in energy supplies with huge economic dislocation resulting from that. So on top of such a minimum program, we need all kinds of other programs to get us through the transition. We need investments in renewable energy and in conservation and in restructuring our economy to meet our needs in new, less energy intensive ways. There's so much we need to do. And discussions of system change in the context of dealing with the climate are essentially about that. How adaptable is the existing system to these extra measures we need to take in order to make the minimum program viable? Now, I want to spend my remaining time talking about political economy of the problem, because this is really central. Broadly speaking, there are two problems that have to be addressed in terms of political economy and go most of the way towards explaining why we've seen so little progress. The first is that there is no getting around it. Reducing fossil fuel emissions by something like 5% a year will lead to a massive energy crunch, even under the best set of policies. And insofar as our only lever for achieving such a policy is whatever amount of political democracy we have in the world, which is, of course, very incomplete, but there is some democracy. This is a problem for democracy because such an energy crunch will in fact affect people profoundly, the majority of the population, very seriously. Green groups have tried to get around that, but they are not trusted very much by people who are not environmental activists. And in fact, I think we do need to be honest and confront this question directly. And whatever we do to enable the necessary policies to take effect, we have to accompany them with measures that are based on broad solidarity, that rather than protecting this small group or that small group, really look to the bulk of the population and trying to make living standards as salubrious as possible for as many people as possible. I'll get back to that in one moment shortly. The second problem, which I think, however, is politically decisive, that is, the first problem is about democracy, and we don't have all that much democracy. We get a lot of programs that are enacted, which most people oppose, and often programs which the majority of people support never get enacted. So democracy is weak, and therefore the democratic problems we face are not necessarily the decisive ones. The critical problem, I believe, is the preponderant problem of capital in really every country that exists around the world. Consider that the capital stock that we see in place is the result of centuries of inexpensive and highly available fossil energy. So with that energy-rich basis, we've developed the way of life that we have, and it's embodied in the investments that are out there. If we were to adopt what I call the minimum program, and no matter what else we add to that, other types of investment spending and so on, there's simply no question but that a very large chunk of capital assets around the world would be stranded. They would be uneconomic to operate. Now, this has become a commonplace bit of knowledge in terms of fossil fuels, and there's a lot of discussion of that, but it goes way beyond fossil fuels. If that's difficult for people to wrap their minds around, just take the obvious examples of Boeing and Airbus. Within a short period of time after the adoption of this minimum program I've described on a widespread basis, those companies would essentially have to go out of business. They have to write off pretty much all of their investments. But they are by far not the only ones. There will, even in the most optimistic scenarios, electric cars or electric vehicles will not replace the full fleet of gas-powered internal combustion engines. And so a large part of the investment in automobile factories would be rendered obsolete. We have a geographic distribution of structures, of buildings, whose demand depends on the availability of cheap fossil fuels. And as that's removed, a large part of the built infrastructure becomes uneconomic. A lot of agriculture around the world depends on cheap fossil fuels. You can go down the list. So what that would mean would be a large part of the invested wealth of the world would lose most of its value. And capital destruction, for obvious reasons, is simply not acceptable to capital. And because capital has preponderant political power around the world, that is a very simple and I think adequate explanation for why the current policies we see fall so far short of what's needed. So what I take from this, and this is what I'm going to end with, is that the implications for green people, and actually anybody who wants to keep the planet in a livable state, is first of all on the democratic front, we are absolutely going to have massive redistributive programs in order to make the energy price increases palatable to the bulk of the population. The simplest way to do it is with per capita rebates of carbon revenues, as advocated by Jim Boyce, for instance, in his recent book, The Case for Carbon Dividends. There may be other ways, but that has to be part of the agenda. But as for capital, we have a big problem. Up to this point, politically, whenever programs are being developed, you get a period of negotiation where the people, designing the program discuss with business interests, can we do this? Can we do that? And the result of those compromises is an array of programs which are simply inadequate. And in fact, we have to recognize there's basically no overlap between what capital is willing to accept and what we need. That is, the no loss of wealth constraint that capital insists on is not compatible with a no loss of planet constraint, which we ought to insist on, which means that going forward, we have to think not about better negotiations with business interests. They actually need to be defeated on this issue. They have to be overcome. So the green agenda of forestalling a climate catastrophe, in my view, needs to be yoked to a political strategy which achieves the power required to overcome the opposition, the complete opposition of capital. Thanks.
Okay, Peter, thank you. I'm unmuted now, right? Okay, Peter, thank you. Eric, are you ready to go? And if we got you unmuted?
Here we go.
Okay.
All right. Jumping right off from what Peter was talking about, as you can see, we are all aware that there are massive changes needed in the economic system, and socioeconomic system, and political system to achieve a sustainable future. And one of the questions that immediately comes forward is, can we afford it? Do we have the money to afford the structural changes that are needed to put us on a sustainable path? And this question usually, unfortunately, comes at the center of the discussions about policy making. And that's unfortunate, because what I'm going to show is that this should not be the case. This is by far the least important problem that we have. And so to contextualize this a bit, you have to go back to the discourse you hear in political life that if there is a program we want to implement, we say we can't afford it, it's the road to ruin, governments are deficit spending and need to tighten their belts, and they need to behave like the rest of us. And so we need to basically think of policy making in financial terms and make sure that we have sound financing. And so what it means that we need to reform existing programs along the idea that they have to put on a path that sustain them and make them sure that we don't have a bankrupt government. Well, there are several issues that come with this way of thinking of policy making. The first one is the facts. If you look at the facts, is that fiscal deficits are a norm throughout the world. Okay? If you focus on the United States, since the 1930s, basically the US government has been running deficits almost continuously. There's about 5 times when that was not the case. Okay, if you broaden that to OECD countries, it's the same thing. Most of them have governments that run fiscal deficits. And so fiscal deficits are not something that are abnormal. Okay, they are the norms. Okay, and so that's the first fact. And so we need to be able to explain that fact. How is it the case that government throughout the world can sustain deficits, when we would think that if you take the point of view of a household, if you continually spend more than what your income is, you're going to quickly run into trouble. But government do that on a daily basis, on a monthly basis, on a yearly basis for decades, and they never run into trouble. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that what you observe throughout the world is that lots of government are issuer of the domestic currency. And that's quite different from us. Okay, we are more the user of that currency. And so with the ability to issue the currency, you can start to see why running fiscal deficits can be sustained years after years, because you have now the ability basically to finance your spending very easily if you can issue domestic currency. The third stylized fact that comes in is the fact that the way this, what you observe through the world is that Treasury and central bank are heavily coordinated. Okay? They talk to each other all the time. We usually think of the central bank as being completely independent from Treasury, and the central bank being the only entity involved in monetary policy, and the Treasury being the only entity of the government being involved in fiscal policy. What you observed, really, if you pay attention to the institutional details, is that the Treasury gets involved in monetary policy making routinely, and the central bank routinely gets involved in fiscal policy making. And the main way the central bank does that is by ensuring that auctions of treasuries are going smoothly. And throughout time, this has gone through many different forms. One has been the US or the central banks buying directly treasuries at auctions. Another form has been today the central bank basically financing the major participants in treasury auctions to ensure that basically auctions never fail. Okay, and so every day, Treasury and central bank talk to each other, and every day they make sure that their policy-making practices work smoothly and that they don't destabilize the economic system. And so once you have all these facts together, the fact that deficit spending is normal, the fact that government issue their own currency, and that central bank and treasury routinely get involved together in making sure that government finances operate smoothly, what you get is an idea that, well, you have here a government basically that cannot run out of finance. Okay, finance is not going to be a problem, and fiscal deficits can be sustained because you have this financial flexibility behind it. So this is usually talked about as monetary sovereignty. Okay, once you have monetary sovereignty, you gain some degree of freedom in your ability to finance whatever it is you want to do. And so you can see that from there, trying to craft or orient the debates around potential programs cannot be framed in terms of, oh, we need to be careful about running out of money. Okay, we can't run out of money. Okay, we always have the money. Finding the money is actually the easy thing. Today in the current world, it's about keystroking amounts on a computer. That's how you find the money. Okay, and practically how it is done, again, is through a heavy coordination between the central bank and the treasury to ensure that the budget passed by Congress and implemented by the treasury can be financially funded easily. So once you recognize that the finance is not the issue, what are the implications? Well, the implication is that, first of all, government can afford to buy anything available for sale in the domestic currency. Okay, So there is no financial limits to do that. Now, the next question is, should it do that? And there come several constraints. The first one is, well, you have resource constraints. Do you have enough resources available in your economy to make sure that the government can spend? If you don't, you're going to have inflationary pressures. That's the first constraint. The second constraint is you have political constraint, which is we need to define what the public purpose is. What should the government be doing in society and how we should get involved? Those are two very important questions to ask. And Peter basically worked through both of them. And I'm going to spend a bit more time on the resource constraint aspect of that. And so once you look at it from the terms of resource constraints, meaning do we have the labor available? Do we have non-labor resources available? Okay. Then you start to think of costs of program, not in financial terms, not in terms of millions of dollars or billions of dollars or trillions of dollars, but rather in terms of what's the percentage of the domestic resources that these programs use. Okay, so if you look, for example, at the Green New Deal policy, okay, some estimates varies, but usually it's in the trillions of dollars. Okay, and immediately the question is, well, it's unaffordable, it's a road to ruin, and the emphasis is on the trillions. Well, when you try to bring that back to the actual amount of resources that these kinds of programs use in the economy, for example, relative to GDP, it turned out to be relatively small, okay? 1, 2, 3%, okay? So once you start to understand what costs mean in terms of resources, you can get a better sense of how stringent a program is going to be. Finding the money, again, is not going to be hard. Finding the resources might be hard. And so that's why you need to frame a program and a view of its cost in terms of, do we have the resources available, and at what pace can we implement a program given the resources we have available. At the same time, as again past experience has shown, it's quite feasible for government, if needed, to rapidly ramp up its spending. Okay, so the last big experiment we have with that was World War II. Okay, when government spending relative to GDP went from about 10% in the early 40s to 45% of GDP about 2 or 3 years after that. Okay, so you can do that. The key then becomes to be able to do that and transfer large amount of resources to the government in a way that is minimally disrupting the economic system. And again, World War II gives you some important lessons on how to do that. Okay, we have had good experience with price control, with tax systems that are put in place to try to dampen purchasing power in the rest of the economy. And so we have experience in World War II with that. If you go back in time, we have similar experience at other times. So it's possible to do it. Again, the point is that you can implement whatever program you want, okay, given these two constraints, the political and the fiscal constraint and the resource constraint. The financial side is not important. But once you recognize that, you start to debate programs and craft programs in a way that puts you in a sounder way to basically face the problem we have today. I'll stop here.
Eric, am I muted? No, I guess I'm not. Eric, thank you very, very much. We needed you to deal with the issue of how do you finance Peter's minimal program. And is the financing an obstacle that is simply impossible to overcome? And I think that you address that very, very nicely. Thomas, are you ready?
I'm ready, yeah.
Go for it.
So hi everybody. Thanks for having me. I'll try to share my screen. Just a moment. Can you see my slides now?
Yeah, I think you're successful. We see ourselves at the bottom, whether you do or not, and we see your screen that you're sharing. So I think we have success.
Good. The question of our session is cutting carbon and investing green. What will it take? I want to have a look upon the problem of economic growth in a capitalist economy together with you. In this talk, I want to try to shed a little light on one capitalist characteristic, namely on growth. Does a capitalist economy has to grow? More concrete, does the GDP has to grow? The GDP is the gross national product, and it indicates the total value of all goods, commodities, and services produced as final goods and services within the national borders of an economy during a 1-year period. And this growth causes unavoidable great damage to our home, our planet Earth. But is it really true that the GDP has to grow in a capitalist economy? Why is this? Isn't it possible to have capitalist economy without growth? If not, why not? And thus growth means that the consumption of our resources have to grow too. The short answer was given by Robert Menasse, an Austrian author. He meant that it is quite simple. The Earth is a sphere, a ball. Imagine our planet. The economy grows and grows and grows. There can't be endless growth in a finite world. But let us investigate the problem more closely. What will it take? They're usually given two answers, degrowth and green growth, or green growth. I'll try to show why both approaches do not catch. On this graphic, you can see the word primary energy consumption. Look out, or no, this is one after that. Here you can see the annual GDP growth rate and also the annual growth rate of energy consumption. Approximately with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, you always have a growth of the GDP and you have a growth of energy consumption. Here you can see the word primary energy consumption. Look out for the renewables. They are the smallest amount of what we consume. We still burn all we can get for our hunger for energy, and it grows and grows. This graphic shows that despite some theories, economic growth is causing a growing energy consumption. Angela Merkel, the almost former German chancellor, told us why it is absolutely necessary that the GDP grows. Without growth, there is no investment. Without growth, there are no jobs. Without growth, there is no money for education. Without growth, there is no help for the weak, and vice versa. With growth, investment, jobs, money for education, help for the weak, and most importantly, trust among the people. And you won't find many politicians who contradict that quote. I doubt that you will find any. Because it is kind of hard to follow online talks for a longer period of time, I would like you to work a bit yourself, but the platform doesn't allow that. I wanted you to brainstorm and discuss this question in a short breakout session with a group of 3 persons, but with this platform it is not possible. So I'd like you to think about the question: what, where, and are preconditions for the growth of capital? And if you could be so nice and write a thought or result of your thinking, or the answer, if you have one, for this question in the chat. Okay, that's be really nice. You have 3 minutes. So the chat is open. Time is running.
Thomas, how do we find that chat room?
The chat is right beside our pictures.
The three,
Right
the
beside
three
the
little,
frame.
the,
I tried to stop the screen sharing. Okay. So at this side, you will have the chat. Can you see it, Robin? There are
no,
guests.
but I'm technically challenged, so others will, I'm sure. Oh,
Okay.
I see, way over there. Got it.
Okay, fine. I'll present the question again. But
Thomas, can you tell if you're accumulating some comments?
I haven't seen any comments so far. There's one. Non-nomadic life and money. So we have one non-nomadic life and money as one answer, or from Jason, as a capitalist, the logic of operating in a market is that I have two choices. I either have to grow or to be outcompeted and therefore go bust. Okay, thanks for your interesting comments. We'll see. We will pick that up in the discussion later on. I want to present two more possible answers. Two prerequisites could be exploitation of ever new energy sources and financial revolution. I wanted to give you an abstract outline for the intertwined relation of creating money, the capital growth, but I overthrew my concept and want to give you something more concrete in the first place before I come to the abstract explanation afterwards. The original story of the story of the example I want to give you is from Heinrich Böll. The fictional example I want to present is, how does an island with a traditional fishing economy come under the growth compulsion? The example of the island is coming more and more in literature or of environmentalists or other people addressing this problem of economy. Heinrich Böll wrote an anecdote to lower work moral in the 60s of the last century. He was a German author who won the Nobel Prize in Literature. There are a lot of fisherman stories out there, especially in concern for the environment, as I said, or criticizing capitalism, but I have never read one before Böll's anecdote. So I guess he was the first, and if there is time, I can tell you the original story. I present you the version of Matthias Binswanger, a Swiss economist who wrote Growth, Compulsion, or Constraint. Eric used the word constraint, so I'll stay with that. To explain the relation between investment, money creation, and growth constraint within capitalist economy. There are a lot of questions left out, but I focus on the constraint to grow because it makes the change to another economic system unavoidable due to environmental reasons. Imagine a peaceful island in the Mediterranean, like in this picture. The majority of people on this island live from fishing. All fishermen use the same traditional small boats. They take their boats out to sea every morning, and then every evening the fish they caught, they sell at a local market. To survive in the long term, the fishermen must use a small portion of their income for repairs for their boats or to replace them from time to time. Also, they have to save money for the survival. The rest of the income they spend on alcohol or other pleasures in the local bars. The people on this island work to live and do not live to work. Accordingly, the savings ethic is poorly developed. You can imagine that Max Weber would never have lived on this island where the Protestant ethic is so lousy. The original fishing economy can actually survive without growth. The fishermen also have no incentive to increase the capital stock, because why should a fisherman buy a second or third boat? He can only go out with one boat, and the other boats would lie around uselessly. So there's also no reason to reduce the pub visits in order to save for a future additional boat. The island economy is a stationary economy. Who else is on the island? The already mentioned pub innkeepers as well as craftsmen who do the repairs on the boats. And then there are also some craftsmen who make boats, which are the only capital goods in the simple economy. All other utensils like fishing nets are made and repaired by the fishermen themselves. One day, strange things happen, not familiar to us. A new local government comes to power and it wants to develop the island. And imagine what? They commission an international consulting firm to work out a concept for the development. So the island is visited by a team of consultants who quickly discover that the fishermen's fishing methods are outdated. They said, do you really want to stay in their Stone Age while the rest of the world is getting rich? Or do you want to invest in new motorboats? With these boats, you could go much further out to sea and significantly expand your fishing grounds. Isn't that an outstanding perspective? Moreover, thanks to larger and deeper nets, you could fish a huge area in a short time, more fish with the same amount of labor. Doesn't that sound great? You know what that means? More fish sales in the future. Wealth and prosperity within a short period of time. Awesome, isn't it? Who could reject such a proposal? Together, the fishermen set up a new company with the aim of investing in a modern motorboat in order to drastically increase the amount of fish caught in the future. But the question is how to finance the new boat. Through savings, maybe. Here's the question of investment. Putting money aside, however, means at the same time limiting consumption. So from now on, the fishermen will have to forego their evening visits to the pub and stay nicely behaved at home. A good fisherman isn't automatically a good capitalist. The innkeeper's income shrinks considerably because the fishermen no longer go to the pubs. Some of them have to close their pubs and leave the island in order to find a livelihood elsewhere on a more drinkable island. Captain Capitalism would have asked them, where were your brains? Haven't you thought of the fact that the innkeepers and their families were previously also fish consumers? Who do you think will buy your fish now when you are gone? What money do you want to save now? How do you want to finance your boat? Captain Capitalism got no answer. Instead, they will try to repair their boats themselves. If possible, instead of using craftsmen for this. In this way, however, the consumption of fish decreases even further since the craftsmen now also have to limit their fish consumption. And the income of the fishermen is decimated once again. The fishermen feel desperate. They are no longer able to save anything at all, since they need their shrunken income entirely for their own consumption. They can't save anything anymore. They need their money to feed themselves and their families. The investment project cannot be realized in this way, and the new boat remains a pipe dream forever. Here, Captain Capitalism jumps in. Get real capitalists, he shouts enthusiastically. Capitalist economy with money creation enables growth. How? Banks, we need banks. Banks create money through credit, and then this economy can grow easily. The fisherman took his advice seriously. Pretty soon, a bank opens a branch on the island and starts lending to local businesses. The fishermen take out a loan. With the loan, they can continue to indulge in alcohol in the pubs, albeit somewhat less carefree, as they now have to think more about the future course of business. By taking out the bank loan to finance investments, the fishermen became capitalists. From now on, they have to fish for profit. No profits, no ability to pay back the loan, including interest. So they have to make profit. What happens? Investment in the new boat is financed by a bank loan. This puts additional money into circulation. Here the money theory comes in, which increases also the income of the boat building company. More worker needed, additional wages to be paid. All that to produce the new boat. Fortunately, we have left-wing immigrant-friendly capitalists on the island. Foreign workers are friendly welcomed. These additional workers will also use some of their income to buy fish from the new company. The company puts the new boat into operation and is thus able to increase the supply of fish. Income increases as well. In this case, GDP increases and the economy grows in nominal and real terms. The higher production of the company meets an increase in demand for fish. How is this possible? This is made possible by the new economy coming into circulation via the investment process. So what do we have? We have a new motorboat, more work and more workers, a higher demand for fish and therefore more income for the fishermen. And thus real economic growth through more consumption. Consumption and investment increase in parallel. Capitalism cannot hold back. This is an economy success story in which a bank loan was used to finance a profitable investment in real capital. All are better off now. Look at the results. The production capacity on the island is expanded. And don't forget, the higher pre-production also meets higher demand. The results of this is a growing economy. But think of this. Economy can only continue to be successful if further investments leads to further growth. Thus, more and more loans must always be granted. These lead to a financing of further investment and thus to a steady expansion of the capital stock. Once the process of growth is set in motion, it must continue in the future. Be aware of this. We are on a critical point here. We have seen the beginning of a capitalist economy as a success story. Now, what about ending the spiral of growth? Why can't there be an end to this rat race? Let's assume after a few years, the fishermen come to the conclusion that they have now invested enough and do not want to expand any further. They are now elderly gentlemen whose children have gone to college on the mainland and have no desire to work as fishermen themselves. So they decide to continue fishing with the new boats for a few more years, but not to make any more new investments, because they reasoned if they simply continue to have the same income, that will be enough for them to pay back the loans they took out and also save enough for their old age. Captain Capitalism comes again, shouting in rage, "How dare you, you bunch of simple fishermen! Don't stop now! Go ahead! You will end in socialist hell if you stop to invest in more boats. The boat building company won't get new orders. The income will shrink as well. Then they have to fire their workers. Then they will leave the island and can't buy you fish anymore. Fools you are! Furthermore, the shipyard will soon close down for good, as no more orders can be expected. The shipyard workers will be absent then too. You sell all the fish to yourself and became communists. Good luck. But this won't be the end. You can still fish large quantities of fish, but because of the decline in demand, prices are falling. And so are the revenues. You begin to make losses, and then eventually you have to forcibly sell the new boats. You have really anti-social attitude. Don't you think of your fellow neighbors? The craftsmen and innkeepers have less and less income, and some of them have to give up their activities. But that is still not enough. You're not even selfish. Since your fishing company makes losses, it will also be unable to service the loan it received from the bank. Then the bank has to restrict lending, which makes it difficult to finance further investments. For any fellow on the island, don't relax, guys. I'm telling you, this is your friend. Otherwise, your once big fishing empire will shrink to its original state. Then you will be self-sufficient again. Self-sufficient and poor, like the majority of this world. Do you really want to be poor? The downward spiral of poverty has to come to an end. Move your ass, become capitalists. We can take care for our environment later on. Let's get rich first. Capitalist optimists assume that growth on the island will continue due to the market competition and the associated incentives and constraints. Without forcing the islanders to invest further, this is because the drive for growth that exists in capitalist economies is also at work on the island. In that, fishermen always want to make higher profits. So that was the short story for the fishermen. I wanted to give you the abstract relations between competition and rivalry, technical progress, and money creation that enforce the growth compulsion. And also, there are a few some growth drivers that does not force growth but drive it. There is one possible solution: participatory economy, because capitalism is not able to solve these problems. There is the solution. And there were on this conference several introductions or some introductions to participatory economy. Check it out, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Thomas. Look, as chair, I'm going to make a few comments about issues that clearly come issues that clearly come up and need to be addressed. One is, how much time do we have? How many years do we have left in order to prevent cataclysmic climate change? And one's answer to that question, I think that's the first question that should be asked. And different answers to that question, will have profound implications for what must be done, what can be done, how can it be done. Another question that, Peter, addressed at great length was, how hard is the transition going to be? Particularly once we've answered the first question, how fast do we have to accomplish what needs to be accomplished to prevent climate change, cataclysmic climate change? Then how hard is this transition going to be? A third thing that certainly arises on this panel and in this conference at large is, well, will the necessary transition require substantial economic system change? Now, I think it's really important to focus on, well, you say economic system change. What exactly do you mean? Peter, for example, has pointed out that, well, it's going to require huge changes in how we transport ourselves, huge changes in energy consumption. Those are some kinds of system changes. But then when people talk about system change, sometimes they mean something quite different. What they mean is the economics. They mean the entire economic system is changed. It's changed from a market system to a planned system. It's changed from a capitalist economy to a socialist economy. So when we ask whether or not substantial system change is going to be required to accomplish what has to be accomplished, it's very important to be clear about when you say system change, what exactly do you mean? Do you mean what I refer to as economic system change, a change from capitalism to some form of socialism? Or are you talking about changes in the way people live, because that can be quite different. That's quite a different thing. Another question that needs to be addressed that I think is very, very important is how fast could economic system change actually come about? And one of the things that I have been arguing now, I mean, I've spent most of my life arguing that we need dramatic economic system change. We need to replace capitalism with participatory socialism of some kind, and that it's perfectly possible. And the sooner the better. On the other hand, if that isn't going to happen in a majority of the countries, and particularly in many of the large countries, within the time frame of when this problem of avoiding cataclysmic climate change has to be solved, well, that's an important thing to know. It's an important thing to know, because if what one's answer to climate change is well, economic system change, but if there's no realistic possibility that the kind of economic system change you're talking about can occur in the time frame that is necessary to avoid cataclysmic climate change, well, that's an important thing to think about. That's an important thing to think about. I'll throw out another thing. Not everybody, in my opinion, who proposes economic system change, when I look at the proposals they make, it's not clear to me that it would solve climate change. So just saying we need economic system change to avoid climate change doesn't mean you actually have in mind an economic system that would accomplish that, even if it were implemented in the majority of the large countries on the planet in the time period that's required. And then one last thing that this is one last comment that I want to basically throw Thomas's way. Thomas, you began your talk with a quote, really, from one of the founders of the School of Ecological Economics. And it was a wonderful quote. And it was, "Infinite growth on a finite planet is impossible." And at the same time that I have admired the cleverness of that quote, I believe it has been one of the most bedeviling comments that has bedeviled environmentalists and people searching for solutions to environmental problems and climate change in particular, now going on decades. Growth of what? Growth of economic well-being per capita? Or growth of what ecological economists define as environmental throughput? And my answer is, if you're talking about growth of environmental throughput, then yes, the planet is finite, and that cannot continue to grow indefinitely, no matter what your economic system is. On the other hand, if you are talking about growth of well-being per capita, That is not the same as growth of environmental throughput. And that as long as increases in economic productivity are less than or equal to increases in environmental throughput efficiency, then economic throughput will not grow. So logically, it is possible for some things to grow indefinitely, even if other things cannot grow indefinitely. And it's very, very important to become clear about that. And I think a lot of the stories that are told suffer from a lack of clarity about that. So that's my 2 cents as the chair. I'm not a speaker, but that's my 2 cents on at least one of the subjects that we all have to address. Now, I need some help in how to see if we have some questions that are coming in the chat. And I don't know,
We don't have questions so far.
Okay, we can see that we don't. Then what I'd like to do is go back. I'd like to go back and have the presenters go ahead and respond to what they have heard from others and points that they would like to go ahead and make they didn't make before or would like to emphasize.
Robin, I would just like to point to you, sir, for the interruption. There is one question in the Q&A.
Oh, can you please have that person, can you read it for us?
Are we headed towards a genuine progress indicator way of looking at growth and the planet? And are we moving fast enough? Is GPI holistic enough? That's from Roxanne.
Peter, do you want to tackle that one?
Sure. I'll make brief comments on a number of points, beginning with that one. Gross domestic product measures the fungible part of the economy, the things which, because of a monetary system, can be exchanged for each other. So if you can have this, or you can have that. If you have more of this, you can get rid of some of it, get more of that within the GDP universe. Of course, many of the most important things in life, including a livable planet, are not fungible. But many important things are. So GDP is okay as long as you recognize its limitations and supplement it with other things. It's certainly not an indicator of well-being in itself. And it was never developed for that. It was developed initially in the 30s as a way of tracking a portion of the economy which was subject to ups and downs in the business cycle, and especially for wartime planning. It was extremely important to determine resource constraints along the lines that Eric mentioned. So that's a small point. Very briefly, in terms of Eric, I would like to say that it seems to me that the major cost of dealing with climate change, the extra stuff that I talked about in terms of the minimal program, is getting through the period of replacing a large part of the capital stock. We're looking, if we do go this route, we're looking at a period of very substantially, historically unprecedented capital losses. And unfortunately, our macroeconomic understanding is really deficient when we look at capital gains and capital losses. There really isn't even any school out there that, in my view, has a decent model of that. And we're just going to have to muddle our way through. This is something I've been working on, but I can't say that I've made a lot of progress on it. In response to Thomas, I'll mention that I have a substantial, like 10, 15 page chunk of the book that looks at the degrowth hypothesis and makes a bunch of arguments, but I'm not going to go into them here. I do want to talk for one moment about fishing. And that is, while I was doing research on child labor in Ghana, I spent some time in a fishing village. And very poor fishing village. There were a few people with some money. It wasn't an equal society, but lots of people were poor, and there was massive child labor. Families had to send their children off into these very rickety fishing boats out into the ocean. And when I was done with my research, I just had sort of chatting with people, and I said, I'm going back to the US and maybe I can talk to people who can help you out. If there's one thing that you could get that would help change your life, what would it be? And they said, refrigeration. Our fish rot. We bring the fish back and they don't last long enough. If we had refrigerators to put our fish in, it would be a huge improvement for us. But of course, refrigeration would require stable electrical supply to keep or a generator or something to keep that refrigeration running. And that, I think, reflects in some broad way the situation of large numbers of people around the world. I'm not going to make a general case for why everybody needs to get richer, but I think there's some people that need more stuff. And if it takes less stuff on our part for them to have more stuff, I can accept that. That'll be it.
So because there's a fishing issue, I don't contradict that. So if some people, especially if they don't even have a refrigerator, want to have one, why not? That was not the point I wanted to make with my example. But as a cultural anthropologist, I would say, I would ask why is the situation so that these fishermen are poor? Because for most societies, before they got discovered from the West, they weren't that poor. On the contrary, mostly the Westerners were very poor. They had no more food, and they saw this, not always, but most often, people who did not suffer, like we have the image today that Africa or American people, Native American people are drinking or not having enough goods for their survival or livelihood. This is a pretty modern phenomenon that has to be addressed. But
Let me say something very brief about the question that we had was about GDP and genuine progress indicator.
Yeah, the first question.
Well, Thomas, I thought you were done. I'm sorry.
No, you mentioned that you shall answer. Your first question was the time that we have left. I don't know the actual IPCC report, but what I have the number that I have in mind is that we have 6 years left, maybe 10, but that's the most to prevent the total disaster before the tipping points, before too many tipping points come into being, and then it's out. We have only don't have more than 10 years.
Well, I actually think that Peter Dorman outlined the answer to that is the most useful, which is.
Can I say it myself?
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay. I mentioned a 5% annual decrease in carbon emissions if we start right away. If we had started 30 years ago, and we should have, that would have been a much lower number and much more manageable. If we wait 5 years from now and then start it, we're talking maybe 6%. And if we've waited a few more years, it becomes 7%. So in other words, the job just gets harder and harder and harder the longer we delay.
I think that's an incredibly important point. I want to throw one thing out that's very simple. The question we had in the queue, which was about GDP and genuine progress indicator. And I mean, Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, but the notion of a genuine progress indicator, it's been around 20 or 30 years now. And what really happened was environmentalists noticed that it was very common to interpret GDP and GDP per capita as an accurate measure of economic well-being. And it was the first attempt to sort of correct that misinterpretation. And the form it took was, well, wait a minute, nobody is counting the deterioration of the natural environment that's going on at the same time that we're producing goods and services that we're counting in GDP. And that any proper accounting of whether or not we are actually as humans progressing or not progressing would at least minimally have to take that into account. And Herman Daly literally resigned from the World Bank when he could not get the World Bank to do that when they were evaluating their various projects. And after resigning from his position as the chief economic advisor to the World Bank in protest against their unwillingness to do that, then the bank actually came around and said, no, we actually need to evaluate things using something more along the lines of a genuine progress indicator. So that's the sort of history of that. But it's a rather minimal correction. It's sort of a very simple correction for what was a very piece of sort of misleading, sloppy thinking that was going on at the time. And I do think the environmental movement has managed to make that correction in a lot of people's minds, has reminded us that if we are destroying the environment during the year, well, then that is one of the consequences of what we've chosen to do that has to be kept, that has to be weighed into the balance of whatever good things we've managed to do through our economic efforts during that time period. One thing I simply wanted to say about Eric's Eric's sort of contribution was, and I think, Eric, I thought you said it very, very, very well, which is one of the things you immediately run into when you talk, for instance, about a Green New. Look what we're debating right here in the United States right now. We have an infrastructure bill. I bet most of us on this panel would argue that if we implemented the infrastructure bill and nothing more, it would probably hasten the environmental, and it would hasten environmental destruction. Because what the infrastructure bill basically addresses is the United States has done something even more foolish than people could possibly imagine. We've allowed our present infrastructure to fall into such disreputable repair that a certain amount of the repairing of our fossil fuel dependent infrastructure is well overdue and called for. Well, if we repair it, since we're repairing the fossil fuel based infrastructure, pretty much as it's been created, all we're going to do is aggravate problems. Well, then the issue is we have this other bill. We have this other bill and it has a price tag. And I love the fact that Bernie Sanders and people who put it together said, well, maybe it actually, we think there's something about a $6 trillion is what is both needed and possible. And eventually that became 3.5 trillion. And now we have Joe Manchin saying, no, I don't want anything more than 1 trillion. And so we have this debate about what can we afford? And I think Eric did a brilliant job of saying that whole debate is basically a red herring that simply convinces people that it's impossible to do what needs to be done for financing reasons, and they're really quite bogus. And instead, what he focused on is exactly the issue we discovered when we changed the economy dramatically in response to the necessities of World War II, which is you can change the composition of what the economy is producing. GM had to produce tanks instead of automobiles for people to drive around on roads in the United States. And one of the things that makes me optimistic is, gee, how fast did that happen? And this is something I would say to Peter a little bit. You're absolutely right that there's a serious problem that the existing capital stock is basically maybe of very limited value anymore. But think about the fact that GM and Ford were producing automobiles in 1939. Now, you could have said, well, if we're not going to produce automobiles anymore because, we have to fight World War II, Well, the entire capital stock and the value of that capital stock that, of GM and Ford, well, it didn't basically disappear. It didn't become a stranded financial asset problem we had to solve. It turned out that Ford and GM were remarkably flexible and figured out that with the same assembly lines and changing things a little bit, that we could produce Jeeps and tanks instead of Model Ts.
Can I respond quickly to that? That's a good point.
Yes.
There are two issues there. The first is the putty clay issue, as economists like to call it, which is how malleable is this capital stock? And it turns out that assembly lines didn't need a whole lot of tweaking to go from cars to tanks or even to small airplanes. That actually, I have this one study that I go into in the book, which did look at that malleability in a way that's kind of comparable to what we'd be looking at with refashioning the capital stock for a post-carbon world, and it wasn't very optimistic about it. But that's it's an empirical question, and the hard answers we'll find out. But the second question gets to the question of giveaways, if you will, or of subsidies. So in World War II, what the federal government did is it cut a deal with business, and business was part of the planning apparatus for this. And they said, okay, we're going to take over your factories and we're going to convert them by force to military production. But guess what? We're going to pay for the whole thing. It's going to come out of the public purse, and you get to keep it when the war's over. And that's exactly what happened. So the taxpayers built the post-war capital stock for a lot of the basic industries through the war production of World War II, and then handed it over free of charge to capital. And some version of that actually might be possible with climate change. That's a longer discussion. I certainly wouldn't be in favor of that. Now that's a financial thing. That's about who bears the burden. It's about transfer. It's not about resource constraints in Eric's way of thinking about it. But there are ways in which we could cushion the blow for capital if we increase the blow for the public. And I don't want to go down that road, but it is one small area where I think there could be some room for compromise. But based on just looking at the debates that have taken place in Europe over the European trading system, the US over carbon programs here, it really doesn't look like capital is willing to exchange the viability of its capital stock for a bit of handout to make it through. But maybe I'm wrong. These are big questions, and we could spend a lot of time in these questions.
Thomas, yes, you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
I appreciate the answers Peter and Eric gave for certain problems, but the question I have is who will bring that about? I mean, there is coming a new movie out. The title is Now, a climate film, and certain scientists and environmentalists are addressing leaders, as Greta Thunberg has already done. She asked them, they protested, she was invited then, environmentalists are invited, and what happens? Almost nothing. So who do we address to bring about our the necessary measurements for saving our planet? I think the experience shows we cannot address politicians. We cannot address the state. As a contrary example, there has been a climate council in France. If you put people together, let them deliberate, think about these issues, let them be, let experts to them and talk about climate issues, then they will change their mind or bring about measures that really work. And when we have the question of system change or who will bring about the change, I think as climate activists, as activists, we have to switch our engagement of our work from the politicians to our neighbors, because politicians or the state won't help. Or I don't see it. But time is over.
I don't have a clock, so I don't know if our session is.
Our session is over.
Okay, our session's over. I'd like to thank everybody. I think this was a particularly interesting session. And I think sessions where people don't necessarily agree are often more interesting and more provocative for audiences. And I'm really happy that this is recorded. And I know, for instance, that one of the things that we're delighted about on everybody that's working on the Participatory Economy website, well, one of the things that we struggle to do is, if you want a website to attract people, you have to put new material up. And this conference has basically provided tremendous amounts of new material that we'll be able to put up, so that even people who did not attend this conference over the next 6 months will presumably, if they visit the website, they'll be able to see, this session and other sessions. And that's particularly fortunate, as we're trying to get more people to think about more of these things. Thank everybody for their participation.
Thank you, Robin, as well. Thanks.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Eric.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.